I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, we have been thinking about doing Shen Congwen for a really long time.
Yeah, Shen Congwen is we've talked so much about modern Chinese literature, and he's a pretty huge figure.
From 1982 to 1988, when he died, he was regularly mentioned as a possibility for the Nobel Prize in Literature.
Yeah, he was huge outside and inside China. He tends to be held up alongside Lu Xun as one of the great fiction writers of modern Chinese literature.
The style of literature that he writes is very much, it's hard to describe. The Chinese for it is 乡土文学. Homeland literature, I guess, is probably the best way to translate that. We don't really have anything like that in English. In German, there is something called Heimat literature. And I'm sure I'm slaughtering that. Sorry to my German-speaking friends. It's just literature about the home place, and it's just more about kind of local color. We actually do that whole genre of local color in English language literature does exist. It's kind of, I don't want to say died out, but it's definitely something that was much more popular maybe 50 or 100 years ago.
Yeah, I would say we don't really have a genre tag for that, at least in the U.S., but I think of authors like Willa Cather, for example, for whom the landscape, the culture, all of those are huge parts of the story.
Shen Congwen is still quite popular.
I think so. At least when I was in China, my classmates really tended to like him more than, say, Lu Xun. Lu Xun people respected more, but they might actually read Shen Congwen, whereas I didn't meet a lot of people that just chilled out and read Lu Xun.
And maybe it's because we're such nerds, but I don't like reading Shen Congwen.
I don't. Okay, see, I was going to save that for later in the podcast, but one of the reasons we haven't talked about Shen Congwen is neither you nor I really like him very much. Before we get too deep in that, we might ought to introduce the story, the novel, I should say, that we're discussing. This is probably his most famous, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it's probably his most famous. It's called Border Town. It is just about this rural backwater in western Hunan. Shen Congwen is drawing off a long tradition of literature that is connected with western Hunan. So Tao Yuanming, which we've done podcast on, Tao Yuanming is not only a poet, but he also wrote one of the most famous early short stories in Chinese literature, the Peach Blossom Spring. There is, of course, the Chuzi, the Songs of Chu, which Chu is an earlier name for the area around Hunan. So there is this long tradition of discussing Hunan, and Hunan being kind of an alternate site. If you think of the main site in Chinese literature as being kind of northern China, the northern China plain, the centers of power, Henan, Beijing, and even I would say Xi'an, which at that time would have been called Chang'an. Hunan has functioned kind of like as the little brother or little sister of Chinese literature. And I think that some of what you see going on with Lu Xun and Shen Congwen is that there is this role that they're playing where Lu Xun is frequently called the father of Chinese literature, as we'll discuss in our upcoming series on Lu Xun. Shen Congwen is kind of like, no one would mistake him for the father of Chinese literature, right?
No, definitely not. Maybe the beloved uncle or something. Like the cool uncle of Chinese literature that brings you candy when your mom said you shouldn't eat anymore, like that kind of guy.
For this week's episode, we actually just looked at an excerpt from Shen Congwen's Border Town that was published in Huang Yunte's Big Red Book of Chinese Literature. He's a professor at University of California, Santa Barbara. I think the anthology is actually quite good. It was a decent translation.
It is quite
right?
good.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very good translation.
Normally, we would begin a podcast by rambling a bit and then talking about plot. Rob, how do you talk about the plot of this book?
Well, this is one of those episodic kind of narratives that also, it's interesting. I don't usually tout an excerpt. I think the excerpts that he chose are very representative because they're cyclical. It occurs pretty much at the same time of several years in a row during a local festival. But the story involves a ferryman, an old man who's been ferrying people back and forth across this river for many, many years, and his granddaughter, Cui Cui, who was abandoned by her mother, who committed suicide to be with her lover in the afterlife. And it follows her as she grows up. What's her life like in this local area? How does she learn about the world? What does this old ferryman do to educate her, etc.? So it's actually a pretty simple setup. Now, as the excerpts go on, you see her getting a little more worldly wise, learning how things go. I'm going to keep my summary brief on purpose because the thing I think that endears Shen Congwen to so many readers, at least in China, is that local color is such a huge part of his stories that plot and characterization, in my opinion, kind of take a back seat. To some extent, reading this, and in fact, I'll mention this too, because I read a good chunk of this in Chinese the first time I came across it. It could be a tough slog in Chinese because there's so many words and things that come from that region that you'll find yourself going to your dictionary every sentence or two, like, wait, what is this? What is he talking about?
I think that's the appeal, right, Rob? The fact that he's drawing off of this region that within China, it's an other. Most readers will have never been to this part of Hunan, but it becomes this kind of magical fairyland as the writings of Tao Yunming suggest. People understand this place, Hunan, and specifically Western Hunan, as this kind of place where weird stuff happens. And so the joy of reading this, and this is I think one of the reasons why it's so hard for you and me to get into this, is that you've probably, growing up in China, you would have heard lots of stories from this region. You would have heard these words and this stuff discussed.
The name that keeps coming back to my mind as an analog in the U.S. is Faulkner, not because they're the same kind of writer, but because Faulkner also, very different, very, very different, but because Faulkner also created a kind of fantasy land out of the American South, which was also a place, if you grew up in New York or Pennsylvania, probably you hadn't been to small town Mississippi, right? But it's thanks to the Civil War, thanks to this whole long history of stories and cultural differences, is also, like Hunan, very much an other, right? So reading about this in fiction for the first time, one of the appeals would have been the dialect that Faulkner was using and the peculiar ways people dressed and acted, the things they bought. That would have been part of the appeal, as it is here. So I'm not sure if people like this because they already know about it or because they don't, and this is a really fascinating way. You feel like you're being thrown headlong into this world.
I think you also have to remember when this is being written. You know, this is being written in the 1930s. Everything is corrupt in China. Like the warlords are battling for power, and then the KMT takes over. Modernity is being forced very violently onto many people in China. There's something kind of bucolic about this piece. Nothing happens. The girl Cui Cui, has this.
She grows up.
She has these encounters, and the episodes that we read, there are references to the different encounters at the different time periods. It's hard to talk about plot because there is no problem, really.
Does there need to be? And this is, my...
Yes, there needs to be a problem to be overcome to have a plot, Rob. Come on.
Yeah, no, that's not what I meant. I meant, does there need to be a plot? My point wasn't in saying that I'm not a huge fan of Shen Congwen. It wasn't because, the story just is lacking, right? Because maybe this really isn't the point. In addition to this being a very chaotic and dangerous period in China, in terms of modern Chinese literature, the stuff that made it modern typically centered in Shanghai or Beijing. Pioneering stories that use local dialects, but were almost always in northern China. This is not that. It's very, very different. And you could see it feeling like a breath of fresh air in this climate, saying, oh, wow, a story about Hunan. We don't have something like that yet.
One of the aspects of modernity that's true of every movement of modernism is there is this kind of need to go back to the old thing, to do the old China or do the old England or whatever kind of, wherever you're doing modernity, there's always this kind of counter movement of like, oh, we're going to get back to the old ways. Of course, those old ways are always imagined. They're made up. I think that's some of the appeal here in Shen Congwen, is that this is like this bucolic setting that nothing goes wrong. There aren't really any problems. Willa Cather, I think, Rob, it was great that you brought her up. In Shen Congwen's work and in Willa Cather's work, there's the sense that everything is solvable, and there was a time when we could kind of get our head around all of the problems that we were facing.
Yeah, people had problems, but they weren't world-ending calamities or something like if you read Chinua Achebe, things fall apart, where literally things are falling apart. There's no way back, right? It's nothing like that. And there are stories like this in the modern Chinese canon, absolutely. Yeah. But you're right, Willa Cather doesn't do that. One of the reasons I love Willa Cather is for that. For me, when I read Shen Congwen, the characters feel like almost afterthoughts to me. Like there's so much a product of the land they come from, of their culture, that they don't have any real distinctive qualities of their own. Reading Shen Congwen at times can feel like a National Geographic special that has fictional characters thrown on top, where the point of the story is to tell you all about this area. Its festivals, its colors, its hills, its waters. Oh, and these people are doing something over here.
But the plot is secondary.
And to some extent, it's secondary in Willa Cather, too. I've read several of her novels, and, you could summarize them in a couple of sentences, right?
I don't know about that with Willa Cather, but that's a different podcast.
That's a different podcast. When I read Shen Congwen, I can only compare him, and this is probably uncharitable, but we've been talking about Lu Xun so much, that's the person I keep comparing him to. Lu Xun is also deeply concerned with how things are in modern China right now, right, in the time that he's writing. But he muddies the waters so much that he leaves you no clear place to stand. You have to be deeply invested in every square inch of the story in order to take something away from it, right? Shen Congwen, I feel like you can kind of kick back and let it float by, right? It's one of those stories where you can read, if you're really tired sometime and you happen to miss a few paragraphs, you're still going to be good to go.
That almost sounds like an insult, Rob.
It kind of does. And if you're listening to this and you're a huge fan of Shen Congwen, by all means, please email us and tell me why. Rob, you have no clue what you're talking about. Let me tell you. I would love to hear it. My only real experience with Shen Congwen is what I've read. I had professors at Nankai that taught him. One of the professors I worked with most recently at Nankai a couple of years ago wrote a whole book on Shen Congwen. I understand the appeal, I think. This local color thing, I get it. It's just not for me.
I think that it's just hard to grasp Shen Congwen out of that context. Maybe you and I just aren't equipped. Maybe we're just morons. I think that Lu Xun is much more interesting.
And I'll just throw this in on the top of your Lu Xun advertisement, because we are coming out with the series soon. There are other novelists in the May 4th movement and afterwards that I think are much better. I prefer Lao Shi. I prefer Shi Zicun. There's a lot of writers I think are absolutely incredible.
Rob, before we go, is there anything that the listener should know?
If they want to have anything more to do with us after we've just said we don't like Shen Congwen. Well, you could look us up on Twitter and Instagram and other places. Twitter at ChinLitPod, Instagram at ChineseLitPod.
Tweet us why you do like Shen Congwen.
Absolutely. You know what? This is impressions, right? If you've studied Shen Congwen for years, you're a huge fan, and we're seriously not getting it, believe me, we would love to hear from you. We're happy to change our minds. ChinLitPod, ChineseLitPod. Email at ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. And, of course, our beer-funded Patreon, Chinese Literature Podcast.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.